All right, we're recording at the
All
class.
right. Thanks, guys. We'll miss you today.
Enjoy. What was the topic that you were going to suggest?
Actually, I didn't have one. I thought, I know that Sam had wanted to dive into some items that he had on his agenda that he was holding in abeyance, but since he's not going to participate today, I don't know that we
Throw
should.
that away.
Set those aside so we don't have to end up repeating them, unless we want to rehearse. So, and I know, at least I'm pretty sure that Sam hasn't had a chance to see that hour-long interview video that I recorded a decade ago. And actually, when I watched it, there was stuff in it that I had no recollection of ever having said. Obviously, I did. So I'd actually forgotten quite a bit of the content. And also, by the way, Phil said that's part one, and I think that's because he recorded for more than was in that first hour. And I don't remember what additional stuff we talked about for sure. I know we talked about other stuff. So I'm guessing he's going to edit together a part two of the additional material from that day of recording that turns out to be whatever was in it, which I don't remember for sure.
Just for the purposes of this recording, this was probably a decade-old interview of an incident that had happened when you had found an inaccuracy on Wikipedia and a whole situation ensued.
Yeah. The inaccuracy that I found was not a little one-off event. It turned out to be part of a much bigger pattern that as I sort of zoomed out, I began to see that I was sort of below radar in a whole series of very similar phenomena, both with respect to the particular topic in Wikipedia and just the general abuse of power by these editing cliques above and beyond that particular topic. So yeah, I sort of got the tip of the iceberg, and there was a much bigger iceberg than I could have imagined. It's a little bit like fractals. You see a little bit of a pattern and you think it's local, but if you zoom out, you see the same fractal pattern is universal. And it's sort of like the old saying, as above, so below. Mm-hmm. Well, so I see a little below, and it turns out it's all just it's a variation of the as above pattern. So this corruption and abuse of power and meritless accusations against rival editors as a technique for marginalizing them, using the rules to shut up the guy who has the other perspective. If you've got the power to manipulate the application of the rules to give your editorial perspective the advantage and disadvantage the others, that turned out to be a very common practice throughout the whole project.
Well, and one of the reasons I was so interested is because a lot of what you described that was happening, I guess, 10 or 20 years ago, even because you're telling the story 10 years ago, but it happened even earlier, is very similar to something that had happened to me in 2016. So when you talk about these cabals,
right,
I knew exactly what you were referring to, except now they had greater technological power.
Exactly.
So let's move on from this, and we could talk about that another time. But it's I hope he can edit down, because that was a lot, it was a long video. It would be nice if he could, shorten it to get the important points out, because there's a lot there. And I especially love where it ended. The last 5 or 6 minutes. Well, I'll leave, that'll be the cliffhanger.
That's where I was zooming out from the particular case that I was addressing to the general phenomenon,
right?
The general corruption and abuse of power and meritless accusations that turned out to pervade Wikipedia across the board. So I was beginning to zoom out at that point to the general observations, and that pattern of corrupt abuse of power, meritless accusations, and shenanigans, and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't just Wikipedia; it was the social networks in general, it's politics in general. It's
politics, yeah, we see it every day. Sure.
Exactly. But what it did is it gave me a glimpse of the dynamics of how these things evolve and how you get caught up in these practices. And what I was thinking as I was watching that video is I'm thinking, here I am, kind of like Cassie Hutchison telling her little picture which is just the little piece of the total corruption that she could witness directly. I'm thinking, I'm kind of telling the same kind of a story. This is the piece of it that I can see. And then others come in and say, well, yeah, the same thing happened to me on this occasion or that occasion, same pattern. So these patterns is what's interesting, not the details of the particular event, but the pattern of abuse that's ubiquitous and persistent over time and space.
Right. And I feel I have a similar story with the same pattern.
Yep. And if you're a victim of one of these abuses, that's kind of a trauma. And the younger and the more naive you are, the more likely that the trauma will sort of haunt you for a very long time. Now, I had the advantage, that I was, well, this is a decade ago, so I guess I was in my mid 60s, and I had a career worth of experience under my belt and analytical and a narrative ability to characterize it. But you imagine somebody who's say a teenager who has this, they don't have the ability to articulate what happened. And so they're going to process the trauma in some other way than simply matter-of-factly sitting down and telling the story in a coherent narrative. And I was kind of thinking about, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and all those. I'm thinking, what was their youthful trauma that in their case led to this bitterness, this cynicism, this wanting to take revenge on the system somehow and get their own kind of justice. And I'm beginning to understand why people who are unlike me, who don't have that scientific and analytical mindset, are simply more likely to do something more emotionally driven and potentially more violent or more dishonest or more corrupt.
Well, I suspect, this would be my hypothesis, that when they were young, they had parents that were a male figure, but maybe a female figure, that were very domineering, very authoritarian. And that, and that's a pattern within the church, within,
Yep.
So I think that would be a common thing.
One of the ways that somebody who is weak at problem solving can solve a hard problem is, first of all, just go to an expert and say, let me tell you this problem I don't know how to solve. Maybe you have more insight. And that's a very ethical thing to do. You go to a counselor or somebody who you think might have more knowledge, insight, and experience, and simply relay the problem and say, is there a solution that you can share with me? But if you have so much emotional trauma over it, or you have the inability to articulate the problem in a narrative, the other thing that people will do, and not for many, I want to say probably less than 5% of the population, they will reenact the problem that they were the victim of, but they will reenact it in the face of somebody who they imagine might be able to act back the solution. Go ahead, Stacey.
I just want to interject two things. One is I just want to point out that having the inability to articulate the problem in and of itself can be traumatizing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's really important to go slow and just think about that, because I think that happens a lot in the moment, and the way we respond to that, we really need to think about that, because the way we respond is usually acting in ways that cause even more trauma by jumping in when we should step back and give that person a little bit of space, because they're already being traumatized by not being able to articulate what they're saying. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, because I suspect that your next point is going to be hard for some people to hear and understand. What you're about to say, I don't think you necessarily mean, or maybe you do, but I don't think the next part is a conscious process. So when you say they bring a problem to somebody so that they will act it out, I want it to be clear, they're not consciously doing it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I noticed this pattern, and it's uncommon, it's rare, but I've noticed it enough times. If you notice something once, it's an anomaly. You notice it twice, it's a coincidence. 3 times begins to say, maybe there's a pattern. So if something happens in the same way 3 or more times, you begin to suspect that this is a recurring pattern as opposed to a one-off or coincidence event. And so a couple of times, a few times in my life, I have noticed this phenomenon, rare, that somebody will confront me with a situation where I'm perplexed. I have no idea how to solve it. But being who I am, I will ponder it. Maybe consciously, maybe in my sleep, I'll be playing it back. And whether or not I'm thinking at the meta level or at the direct level, if I can come up with a response that I imagine is going to be constructive, I'll enact that response. And what I find is that sometimes you can enact a response which is simply a conversation, a narrative. But sometimes you have to enact a response which is not in words. You have to act out the response because they don't decode the narrative. They only imitate the observable behavior. I'll give you an example.
But before you give me an example, I want to say, this is where you and I usually disagree. This is where I usually don't think that's a good approach. And sometimes I think it makes matters worse. And maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I'll listen to the example that you're going to give.
Which are you disagreeing with, the narrative response or the acting out response?
The acting out response.
I'll give you an example. And Kayla, I wish Kayla were here because I think she would agree. There was a kind of dancing that teenagers developed back, I don't know, 30 years ago, called break dancing.
Right.
And they would get on sort of like on their back or down on the ground, and they would do this break dancing. Now imagine that you saw some adolescent break dancing and you tried to describe it in a narrative to somebody else, another teenager who never saw it, and said, I saw this kind of dance, let me describe it to you and see if you can do it. Almost surely they would not be able to decode the description. But if you show them a video of somebody breakdancing, they say, oh, I see. And so there's lots of things where the motion is so complex, but in some sense graceful, that's understandable, visually understandable, then you can imitate it. So this sort of this,
Right.
I can, here's one that I use sometimes. And this will, the interpretation of this is unimportant, but let's say I do a gesture like this. I do it on the screen, okay? So I'm pointing in some direction in space with my index fingers. And the direction I'm pointing is oscillating. It's going up and down, it's going front to back, and it's also going side to side, okay? And if you count the frequency of up and down versus side to side versus front to back, they're in the ratio of 1 to 2.
Right.
One of them is going twice as fast as the other two. And the reason I bring that up is because if you try to say, well, I want you to make a motion of pointing not in a circle and not in a pendulum, but in a three-dimensional thing where the oscillation is one frequency in this direction and a different frequency in those directions, and I try to explain that in some narrative, it's probably going to be completely glaze your eyes over.
Right. So that's not the part I'm disagreeing. I agree with the showing. What I'm saying is that it's important not to show the negative behavior that the person is exhibiting. It's
Exactly.
important to show the positive way
Yes.
that they could be.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
the distinction. Yeah.
Exactly.
Modeling the right behavior.
Exactly. So you don't act back a mirror image, you act back, I won't say an anti-symmetric image because that
Complementary? Would it be complementary?
it
Because
may
it
be
would be a
complementary,
shadow and
but-
a light.
Well, for example, this is complementary. Okay, so if I do this and you do that, but you do it out of phase, you're still doing the same thing, it's just out of phase. So complementary may or may not be the better way, but if I do something different, like this, as opposed to this is collision, and this is do-si-do. So in
But what would be the
square
I'm
dancing,
sorry.
in square dancing, you don't bump into your partner. You do lots of complicated moves and element left and do-si-do, and you never collide in square dancing.
Right.
So if you're trying to get out of a collision, you say, well, we could do it this way, do-si-do, or element left. So what you'll have to do is something that is not the mirror image or reversed in time, because it's still going to have the wrong outcome. So you might have to invent a new dimension of motion or behavior that
Like a
avoids the problematic dimension. The
So
collision.
it's like a bridge. So it's almost like a bridge.
Right.
Or a,
Yeah.
a bypass.
And often that's hard to imagine because you have to imagine a gesture which is not already present in at all. You have to imagine an alternative gesture. I remember watching, I think it was a James Bond movie where there was a chase scene. And at one point, surprisingly, where he's on the ground and you could tell they're gonna, he can't escape because they're both on the ground. And suddenly you, from sort of off in the distance, you see him rising in a helicopter. And that's a shock because you never thought, oh, the way out of this is get off the ground. And so he goes up, vertically, and you go, oh, he added a new dimension to the space they were trapped in. They were trapped in this space, two-dimensional surface of the earth. He adds the third dimension.
Well, I was going to say space.
Yeah.
Space is what you need.
Now, in 3 dimensions, so far, that's not too hard. But now if you're in a 3-dimensional space and you're still colliding, now you have to do it in time. Now you have to change the rate at which your it's like 2 cars are colliding, but if one turns at a certain time, you can avoid the collision. So adding perturbations in the time dimension to get out of sync. So keep adding new dimensions. And after you run out of 3 dimensions of space one at a time, the typical human brain kind of runs out of ideas.
My eyes are starting to glaze over.
So anyhow, but the point is that you have to invent something novel. Now, if you remember Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure, where he's in the bike bar and he's surrounded by all these bikers, what does he do? He gets on the table and he does a tap dance. Turns on the jukebox, he does dancing. Complete. So instead of having this confrontation, he turns to song and dance. And that somehow, startles and arrests the behavior of the bikers. So there's lots of ways of observing in real drama, very carefully crafted drama, where the protagonist devises something novel that the audience doesn't expect. And that's what makes them entertaining.
Well, to simplify this conversation, to me, the best takeaway is time and space is useful in conflict resolution. Can we agree? Can we agree on that?
That's one of the 4 dimensions to consider perturbing. So, for example, backing away. Instead of saying, I'm going to give you space and time. We can continue this, but not right now.
And not too much time and space.
Yeah, but not forever.
Right.
Sometimes when people say, oh, let's talk about this later, they mean later means never.
Exactly.
So what you saw me do in cases is I would turn to my blog, which is outside the space and time of Wikipedia, and I would write a memoir or a song parody or some other response that is outside the domain of behaviors which are in conflict.
I'm just putting in a note that I just want to be able to slice that after the video.
I saw you were.
Yeah, sorry.
I didn't want to collide in content while you were processing something else. So innovative practices has sort of been my stock and trade. Innovative solutions to complex problems. And so getting back to this thing about when somebody dumps a problem in your lap by acting out a life problem in front of you, I have come to recognize that as a gambit that a small percentage of people will do. But when it happens, I'm more likely to recognize it and think about, why is this person acting out this gesture, this annoying or problematic trolling or whatever you want to call it in front of me? And I think, oh, but probably because they've been on the receiving end of it in the past, they have no idea what the best practice is.
It's also very easy to mistake that, though, online with text.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People
Very
can't tell if I'm being sarcastic or serious. I mean, even people who know me well sort of go, is he pulling my leg or is he?
Right. And if you don't know I mean, I have this one friend and he's so funny, and he'll make up these really funny things. It could be about spoons. He could be talking about anything. And there'll always be this one person in the crowd that gets all excited, like, is everything okay? or you already, they don't realize he's joking.
Yeah,
And yeah,
that's called having your antenna. And I've been diagnosed as not always having my antenna out, and the intent or the, the mood or the, demeanor, and misinterpreting the demeanor as hostile versus being silly.
right.
So there's a famous passage in Dr. Strangelove where Peter Sellers, as the president, calls up the president of the Soviet Union and says, one of our generals went and did a silly thing. Went and did a silly thing, and you have to laugh because obviously launching a missile is not a silly thing. It calls it so.
Little mistake.
And then they're arguing about it, and they're arguing about whether they should equally feel bad about this silly thing. So the satire and parody is one of the ways of adding a new dimension to diffuse the issue. And I love satire and parody, but it's also a skill that the average person is not trained to do. I mean, it's not, you don't get a master's degree in writing satire and parody. And if you're very good at it, you end up on Saturday Night Live as a writer or a performer. So, this is good entertainment. But in real life, in social networks, sometimes that is the optimal solution, but you don't have the skill to pull it off.
But you know what, Barry? I think it's really brought us to a bad place right now because we're at a time where many people can't tell the difference between a fictional story or a real life story. And conversely, many times people have had to hide the truth within a fictional story. And that's a shame too.
Yeah, but it's also a very good gambit because you've probably heard me say this, fiction is a great scam. Literary fiction is a great scam. You get to tell the truth while pretending to lie.
Right, but how good is that?
It's better than telling the truth directly by naming names and getting clobbered,
Right, but the very best, this third option would be being able to tell the truth and not get clobbered. How about that one?
And so you look at the January 6th committee, and the people who are not testifying are afraid of getting clobbered. And these are very high level people.
Correct.
They're afraid. They know that Trump takes revenge. They know that, and they've seen him. In fact, they've even participated.
It's not just Trump taking revenge. Look at the base that are attacking anybody in their own circles or anybody. I mean, and again, I don't even want to make this all about Trump because this happens in neighborhoods having nothing to do with Trump. It could be some other issue. This is how people can behave.
And this is what's interesting because then if you look for wisdom from the culture about this practice of vengefulness, taking revenge, two mottos come to mind. One of them comes from the Old Testament, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. You may have heard that one.
Right.
Now that comes from theology. The other one is, I think it's, I don't know if it's I think it might be Confucius, I forget for sure. He who goes on a journey of revenge had best dig 2 graves. You ever heard that one?
No, but I like that
You
one.
can look it up. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's whosoever goes on a journey of revenge had best dig 2 graves. Now it's basically the same concept. Don't take revenge. It's a dumb idea. It's going to end badly.
And to put a nice twist on that, there's also the saying, the best revenge is to live a happy life or a great life or however you want to, whatever word you want to put it.
So now revenge is equal and opposite. Somebody hurts you, you hurt them back. That's revenge. And the first thing that they say is if you're going to hurt somebody back because you're a child and you feel like you got to hurt them back at less than par. Why? If you hurt them back equally, you've got a continuing fight at the same level. You hurt them back at a higher level. If you don't kill them, they're going to escalate. Okay. So what you want to do is get the feedback loop to descend. So if you back a little bit less and a little bit less, a little bit less, you're getting sort of the gratification of revenge, but it's sub-revenge, it's subpar, and eventually it's down to, just.
Well, the whole idea of de-escalating the energy.
Exactly. So de-escalating versus escalating versus maintaining the same level. So when the Old Testament says, it doesn't say an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It says no more than an eye for an eye, no more than a tooth for a tooth, no more than limb. You're going to take revenge, do it less than par. And that's a subtle distinction between an eye for an eye and no more than an eye for an eye that most people don't appreciate. The quantitative amount has to be less so that the sequence descends. And Buddha comes along and says, if you're going to do it to have it descend, then have it descend as rapidly as possible. That is, don't throw back a punch at all, so that it descends to zero in one step instead of in 7 steps. And then the New Testament comes along and says, oh, reverse the sign. Don't throw back a lunge, throw back a hug. Now that's really hard to do, but you get the idea, is reverse the sign of the response. So instead of throwing back hate and violence, throw back love and kindness or something else.
And I think that's where you get expressions that are attached, you know, whatever you put out comes back to you. You know, those are all things that are designed to show you why this practice makes sense.
Right, because if you take it out on a scapegoat, instead of hurting the person who hurt you, you take it out on a lesser party, then it's going to go around over a long period of time from the scapegoat on around. And so the scapegoating is sort of this alternative of don't blame the real source, pick a fake blameworthy scapegoat to get even with the scapegoat. And that turns out to be a really dumb idea. Even though it's biblical, it's a really dumb idea.
Well, and here's where this makes sense to kind of punch up. When you're punching up, you're sort of dissipating. I don't know the right word, but it's like you're spreading out the impact. So it is diluting the punch in a sense.
And so when I punch up, I do it with satire and parody. I make fun of I don't deny the situation happened, but I make fun of it by writing a parody or a satire or a song parody or whatever. And so that's my therapy. My therapy is writing the song parody. Now, it turns out that the person I'm writing a song parody about is usually pissed off, but they can't. Now, if they were to turn around and write a song parody about me, that'd be great, because they're now adopting a better solution. But if they simply can't deal with it, what they'll do is they'll disconnect. And so they'll basically block me, ban me, separate. So sometimes they will separate, and sometimes they will laugh. And if you can get them to laugh, then everybody wins. Now that often, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes they laugh and sometimes they get mad and separate. And that's important, because if they separate, they've solved the problem for you. Now you haven't solved their problem, and they're going to turn around and probably pick on somebody else. Maybe.
Yeah, because yeah.
So it's a partial solution, but not optimal. And so, but I think that's why people write literary fiction and poetry and plays and song parodies and all this kind of stuff, is processing the trauma in a way that's therapeutic and minimally harmful to the world. Now, the person who knows that they're the butt of the joke, they may not be happy. And that's why people try to conceal who was the source of the parody. And if you can do that so they don't take offense, oh, that's about me.
Well, you know, that's why it was interesting in the video in the interview you did yesterday. It was interesting that you started out not using names and you were instructed to use names, which had I been there, I would have said, no, you were doing it right the first time. Don't use names, because you were talking about a common pattern. There was no reason to single somebody out. And had you not singled somebody out, who knows? You may have been allowed to continue.
Exactly.
Might have been the difference.
Exactly. And, you know, this other fellow was going to do not simulated, but synthetic cases with not real people, but sort of conjured up from the pattern, but not naming names. And I don't know whether I was foolish to name names or not. In the long run, I don't think I was. In the short run, yes, because what it did is it sundered the Wikiversity community. On the other hand, the Wikiversity community wasn't producing very effective educational material because it was academic and bland, and it didn't have an audience. So in a sense, in the long run, I think it worked. And the one guy, Paul Mitchell, the felonious monk, the one who really tried to do the max amount of damage, he ended up being hoist on his own petard, because what he did to me, he did to more prominent people at the same time. And the prominent people took him to the Supreme Court, and they examined the pattern, and they said he's guilty of abuse of power and making meritless accusations against others. Well, he had been making meritless accusations against me, but who the hell cares, right? But when he was making meritless accusations against a lot of people, that basically raised everything above threshold, and that he was unanimously convicted of abuse of power, making meritless accusations, and I forget what the third.
When you say convicted, you're talking about you're not talking about United States government, you're talking about Wiki government.
The arbitration committee of Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, okay, got it.
So he did the same thing to lots of other people, and my case was simply one example, and it was mostly below radar, but in the process of relating the story, others could see that the pattern that I was describing matched the pattern in other cases they knew about, which I didn't. And that allowed the whole thing to come to the point where the arbitration committee was brought in. And then they basically stripped this guy of his administrative power. And he basically disappeared. By the way, he lost his job at Macy's. I didn't mention this in the article. He lost his job at Macy's. And I can't prove that that's why he lost his job. All I know is that he stopped, when he got convicted on Wikipedia and disappeared from Wikipedia, he also disappeared from Macy's and became an independent contractor.
Well, people have patterns of bad behavior.
Exactly.
So if he had a pattern here, I'm sure he had a pattern somewhere else. Okay, is there anything else that we wanted to talk about? Maybe shifting topics?
Be my guest to pick a different topic. Anything you want to talk about?
I actually wanted to ask you a question. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I am interested in knowing about the difference about an origin of a word.
Okay.
The word whole, I noticed that, I just want to know if you know anything about the word whole when you use the word W in front of it to mean like the whole thing, as opposed to when the W is removed and it's a whole.
What I do know is that the word holy, which is a theological word, and the word whole with a W are really the same word. And so holy is about creating a whole system that's self-contained, self-consistent, self-integrated, self-sustaining. And so if you have a gap, or think of a jigsaw puzzle, either with a hole in the jigsaw puzzle or an incorrect piece that's in the wrong place, then you have less than a whole system, less than a complete system. So the whole without the W represents a partial system that's incomplete or broken in some way. And so healing and healthy and whole and holy really are fixing the part that's wrong. And there's a phrase in theology that if you think about the brain and the mind and sort of getting a completely comprehensive mindset, there's a saying that some theologians will say, there is a God-shaped hole in your soul. That is, you're missing something that if you had it would make you whole. And what's the shape of that thing that's missing? It's like you look at jigsaw, you can see the shape of the missing piece, but can you actually find the piece or the pieces that fit in that hole? And so to some extent, the gaps and the misconceptions are important, because if you could fill them in, that would be divine. That would be fabulous. If you can find, what is the thing I can't figure out? What is the thing I'm doing wrong? What's the diagnosis of the mistake? Okay. How can I fix the mistake or the thing I should be doing but not doing? And if I can get that, that would be divine. So they're all related in the sense of healthy, wholesome, complete, no gaps, no misconceptions. So when I talk about gaps and misconceptions, that is in a way a secularization of theology. Because you can say the same thing in theological language. You can say the same thing in psychological language or medical language or philosophical language. And the question is, what language works best for your audience? And it depends on your audience.
Thank you. I was just reading something, and you know I'm very interested in the symbolism of different letters.
You may know that I adopted HOLE as an anagram and an abbreviation.
I didn't know that.
It's in one of my more favorite blog posts. So one of the misconceptions that I've mentioned in the past is a misconception that undergirds the introduction of the rule of law, the crime and punishment regulatory model in our culture. And I point out that if you go back to the axiomatic assumption that undergirds crime and punishment or the rule of law, the underlying axiom is a misconception. It's a mistake. It's a math error.
Yes. Okay.
And so I first I call it Hammurabi's original logic error, because Hammurabi is sort of well known for writing down the first written version of the rule of law. But really, you shouldn't blame him, because he only wrote down what was already in circulation. So then I changed it to humankind's original logic error, HOLE. So if you adopt this misconception that undergirds the rule of law, humankind's original logic error, you have a hole in your head, which is a pun, right? So I say everybody who adopts that misconception and acts as if it's correct has a hole in their head, which is a silly way of saying you're laboring under an axiom that you ought to discard, because mathematically it's not going to lead to the outcome you pray for or anticipate or promise.
Thank you for that.
I think I told that story when I was a juror in a case, and I write down on my juror card, I disbelieve in the Hammurabic method of social regulation. Remember that story? I don't know if you were there when I told it.
No, but I could just imagine.
So there was a real case, and it came to trial, and they were going through the jurors trying to decide who to put on the juror. And so I could see where they pull up my card number, and I could see that he's reading it, you know, your age, your highest level of education, blah, blah, blah. And then the part where you could write anything in. And I could see that he gets down to the part, and he goes to startle. So he calls me up, the judge calls me up to explain, and I say, and then the defendant is sort of waiting to be, you know, to go on trial. And I have no idea what the charges are at this point. But I say, but the presumption is he's there because he's done something against the law or problematic. And I say, he said, I tell the judge, I believe that there is a treatment that would improve this defendant's future behavior. But I believe that the ritual that you propose to undertake here is ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst, that it will not improve his future behavior. And the judge says, well, can you perform the duty? I said, I can perform the ritual just fine. I simply have no faith that the outcome is what you pray for. So they dismissed me. So on the way out,
This is what I want to know.
on the way out, I asked the clerk, I said, by the way, what was the charge against the defendant? And she looks, oh, habitual offender. He had been offending time and again, and every time he came through the system, his behavior was getting worse. The very case.
So he proved your point.
Proved the point. I said, yeah, there's a treatment that'll make his behavior in future better, but I have no reason to believe that this one is the one that's going to work. It'll probably make it worse. Sure enough. So that's, I don't tell that story very often, but I think it's that's a great story.
It is. So what else is going on?
So let's see what else is going on. That's worth telling. Most of it is just, you know, trivial stuff. Let's see. Well, I'm actually pretty encouraged by Sam's becoming interested in some of these abstract topics, this deep grokking. I mentioned this before, that because I have all this time on my hands, been retired and kind of still in lockdown, because first of all, I live alone, so I don't have anybody to go out to dinner with, you know, so I don't go out, you know, on the town. So I have a lot of time at home. And I've been watching a number of YouTube videos on topics of interest to me, some of which have to do with science and math and presenting abstract ideas. But one of the channels I really love is this puzzle solving channel, which revolves around variants of Sudoku, not just Sudoku, classical, but sort of Sudoku plus extra stuff. And the guys who solve it are world class. They're world class champion level solvers of cryptic problems, of which Sudoku is a popular example. And what they do is they record themselves live solving it. And daily. They put the YouTubes daily. And as they address the problem in front of them, which they haven't seen before they bring it up, they articulate, they narrate their thinking process as they try to figure out what to do. And
You want to say the name of the, Barry, you want to say the name of the channel for the recording?
On YouTube, it's called Cracking the Cryptic. Cracking the Cryptic. The two guys are Mark Goodliff and Simon Anthony, the two people who they've been doing puzzle solving, crosswords and cryptics and Sudokus and all that stuff, I think for maybe 15 years. And they started this Sudoku channel on YouTube, which now has, I think, over 500,000 subscribers, which is a lot for something as arcane as that. And what knocks my socks off, because I consider myself reasonably competent at logical thinking, mathematical logical thinking. And some of these puzzles that they solve, the logic that they use is airtight, but I never would have figured it out on my own. The logic is so intricately divine that you can see that it's correct. But if you were to turn it off and say, now let me do it by myself, you go, wait a second.
Can do it.
I know that there's a way because I saw it, but now I can't reconstitute it. And the more that you watch these, the more you sort of pick up the key ideas. And what it reveals to me are two things. One is that a small set of rules, which these puzzles have, the puzzles are basically a paragraph. A small set of rules can define a problem which there exists exactly one solution that fits all the rules and violates none. And it's really, really hard to find the one solution that breaks no rules. So the first thing I think is if you have a set of rules, the average person couldn't possibly find a course of action that doesn't break a rule. Or if they found it, would take a hell of a long time and blood, sweat, and tears, and they would make tons and tons of mistakes. And when I try to solve a lot of these, I find myself making a mistake, which I don't realize I'm making. And then I get to, I have an inconsistent grid and the numbers are clashing, and I finally say, okay, I'm defeated. So rule-based systems, even very simple ones, can be extremely challenging to find a correct solution that doesn't violate them. And it takes a genius level person to be able to find it. And then I go back to out of the puzzle department and into science. And I say, there's a set of laws of nature to be discovered. Newton and Einstein and trying to find the laws of nature for which all of our observations agree with these laws of nature that we're looking for. And that's also very hard to do. And it takes a genius to find the laws that govern what we observe. Even though we have lots and lots of observations, to say, why is it always that way? How can I find a set of laws of nature that predict what I'm going to see? And then I look at our culture and I go, this genius level, whether it's going from finding a solution that fits the rules or finding the rules that fits the observation, those take genius level effort. And our human population is nowhere near in that class. And so we have very erratic legislative rules, which everybody's breaking all the time because, first of all, they're mutually inconsistent. There's a lawyer, I think he's retired now in Boston, civil rights lawyer named Harvey Silverglade. He wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day. And he pointed out, if you take all the laws that are on the books and you look at an average person's daily behavior, just simply trying to lead a normal life, that on a typical day, he will commit 3 felonies. The average person will commit 3 felonies a day, at least, just trying to lead a reasonable life. And so our laws are full of what's called antinomies. Antinomy is a technical term for saying there's this law that says you can or can't do this, and there's that law that says you can or can't do this, and they're mutually inconsistent. That whatever you do, you're going to violate one of them, okay? Or maybe both, but you can't find anything that's consistent with both. And so the problem of antinomies in law, or simply the ability to simply be bewildered by them, and you don't have the brain power to figure out how to run your life consistently. And now you look at the Trump White House, and the lawyers working in the White House can't figure out what to do. What can the president do that's not a violation of the law? And they're arguing over whether it is or isn't. So you have all of this behavior, which is either intentionally or unwittingly in violation of some law that you want to have enforced. And so if the office of the president can't figure out how to not break the law.
Well, I'll just jump in. In this case, in Trump's case, I would say he's not really concerned about breaking the law because he has learned through experience that all you have to do is keep postponing and he will never have that judgment day. Yeah. So he's not really concerned about breaking any laws because he knows he's probably not going to have to answer for any of those things. It'll just keep getting put off till he's dead.
And the compliment of that is when he says something that's a falsehood. Does he know it's a falsehood and he's lying, or is he deluded and believing the thing to be true and not realizing that he's speaking a falsehood? And this is much harder in human civilization to have a belief that happens to be a misconception, happens to be a falsehood, and not realize it, and act as if it's a correct belief, and therefore do something that's ill-advised, but you don't know it's ill-advised, but it's going to lead to a downstream problem. And so the inability to recognize a misconception and correct it is a ubiquitous problem in human society. And we have people who are perfectly well-meaning, who are doing perfectly foolish things, and I've certainly done perfectly foolish things, which if I had known better, I would not have done that, because I would have realized that I'm setting myself on a journey that's going to end badly.
But that's the difference. If you could look back at it and say, okay, if this were the information I had been given then, I would have behaved differently. That's the difference right there.
Yeah.
If you're a person that can't even answer that question, no, changing the information and no.
Yeah, that's the metacognition. The metacognition is saying, I was thinking this way, but it didn't turn out the way I anticipated. Why not? Is the world more complicated than I thought? There was elements of the world that behaved outside of my concepts, or are my concepts just mistaken? Are you simply using a bloody stupid model? So are my mental models wrong, or are they simply incomplete? And the ability to review and edit your mental models and find the mistakes and the gaps. You have to say, well, is it a gap? Simply there's a detail that I wasn't paying attention to, or is it a misconception? I got something in there that doesn't belong. And that is really hard. I mean, that's what scientists and mathematicians spend their whole life trying to do, is trying to find the gaps and misconceptions, fill the gaps and correct the misconceptions. And that's a lifelong career effort for scientists and mathematicians and engineers. And the average layperson with the average layperson's education is nowhere near that level of being able to self-diagnose these gaps. So they'll go to a shrink, or they'll go to an expert. And then when you go to an expert, does the expert have the insight that you lack? Maybe they do, and maybe they don't. So even when you go to an expert and you say, I'm out of my league on this one, can you give me some guidance? How do you know that the person you went to for guidance isn't making a comparable mistake? And when I try to play a role as an educator, and try to straighten out somebody who's got a misconception in science or math, how do I know I'm not making a mistake either in the content or in the pedagogy? And more often than not, my mistake will be in the pedagogy. That I'm trying to fix it, but I'm using the wrong technique, the wrong educational technique to reveal the gap or the misconception. And I run into this problem all the time. I say, why am I not, why can't we get to an agreed upon understanding of the science or the math? Where's the mistake? Is the mistake in the pedagogy, or am I trying to teach something that itself is incorrect? And then I got to sit there and figure out, all right, why is this going awry? Why is this taking so long?
I think that's why I bristled a little bit. You may not have noticed, but when you talked about engineers and mathematicians and whatnot, because I know very well that as children, we are able to see patterns that are there and we're ignored.
Yes.
And that there is a key there. There is a missing piece collectively in that wisdom
Yes.
that isn't taken into account.
Yeah. Part of the problem is when you're a child and you see a pattern, you don't have the vocabulary word that gives the name of the pattern. If I can find the name of the pattern and I can mention the name of the pattern, then I can communicate what I'm seeing. But if I'm seeing a pattern and I don't know the name of it, how am I going to describe a pattern? I don't have a language to describe a pattern, except if the pattern already exists and has a label underneath it saying, this pattern has this name.
But so here's my point. Somebody like me, for example, I carry that, I'll call it childhood wisdom. I carry that with me, but I'm not an engineer.
Right.
I'm not a mathematician. And so some people may not value what I have to say or my input as much as other people might.
So how do you communicate the structure of a pattern? If the structure of the pattern is somewhat complex, you can recognize it. Some neuron fires and say, there's that pattern. And the name of that pattern corresponds to the name of the neuron that's firing, but that neuron doesn't have a name because neurons don't have a name. So you say, okay, I can see the pattern. How can I characterize the pattern in such a way that the other person understands the structure of the pattern that I'm referencing? And that's the heart. If you don't have a public name for that pattern, and the narrative that describes it is impossible to decode, then you can see a pattern, you can recognize the pattern, you can be exasperated by the pattern, but you can't depict the pattern in a way that another observer said, I now see exactly the pattern you have in mind.
I know the answer and I know the quote you're going to use, and I can't remember. It's where you cannot blank, blank, blank. You must create a story. What's the whole quote?
Umberto Eco quote, whereof we cannot express a theory, we must narrate a story instead. And so you make up a story where the story kind of follows the pattern. And if you look at the corpus of stories in human literature from modern times all the way back to ancient times, you find a lot of stories repeat. West Side Story is Romeo and Juliet. Same story. So you can, if you study stories, you can see that here's the same story transposed to a different time and different characters, but the dynamics is the same. And so if you see enough examples of the stories and you say, how is Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story alike? And if you can find the elements of the story that align, never mind that one's on the west side of New York City and the other one is, I don't know, medieval, whatever the hell it is. If you can line up the structure, you can, and if you have enough examples, you can make the structure of the pattern visible, metaphorically visible. And stories do that. And if you have enough stories, you can begin to see patterns. And so like Carl Jung would see these archetypes, these character archetypes. And so the characters in these stories would enact these character archetypes. And Jung said, every human being can map to some storybook character archetype. And if you can find the storybook character that's closest to your archetype, then you can figure out who the hell you are. And the classical ones that Jung found were the Fisher King and the Handmaid's Tale. Handmaid's Tale? I think that's what it's called.
I don't know, but this would be the time where I would just want to interject the trilogy that Anna Lois Smithson and Gene Houston have created, which is Future Humans trilogy, where they create a new story and new archetypes and for a multi-sensory beings in a future.
Yep.
I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I would recommend it. You know, I have read the first one.
So fantasy future stories are possibilities for which there are no currently living archetypes. So Superman, for example, your comic book superheroes, there is no living person who has all the faculties of a alien from Krypton or Spider-Man who got some kind of a spider bite. So they will create archetypes which are in some sense superhuman, including, satanic and demonic and divine and all kinds of things like that. Doesn't matter. The point is that you can create characters which are very recognizable and characters which are not recognizable because nobody's like that yet. They're
Well,
too perfect.
except
Demonic.
in their case, I don't know if they would say it out loud, but these are not superhuman characters. These are real characters.
Very close. So you could say, I could be just like Hermione Granger or Harry Potter. There's nothing about them that I couldn't emulate. Maybe, maybe not. So the question is, what are their traits? Courage, or whatever you want to say, whatever Boy Scout traits you want to enumerate, and you can write a storybook character where they have all those traits and none of the flaws, none of the gaps. And they say, can I live up to that standard? And people sometimes try to live up to a storybook standard, and sometimes they'll say, screw that. That's not a boring life.
I think it's kind of foolish to think that we could have all of one. I mean, I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, we're all flawed. And in fact,
I don't even know if I see that as a flaw. I think I see it as maybe we're not using the ingredients properly or in the right balance, but I don't see it as a flaw. It's just
have you ever played games like Dungeons and Dragons where you make up an avatar character? So where you make up an avatar character to play in these games, you're supposed to define a character that has an express flaw in it, a character flaw. The Greek word for character flaw is hamartia, Hamartia. And so every character in Greek literature has at least one character flaw. So this concept of hamartia, character flaw, is an essential ingredient to make a story, because otherwise you don't really have a story. And the most common example of a character flaw is hubris. So hubris is sort of, if you say, what are all the character flaws that you find in Greek literature? Hubris is sort of the one that everybody, so yeah, so arrogance, okay? So believing that you're greater than you are and greater than everybody else. So hubris or narcissism, something, believing that.
I mean, if you look at our society, I think hubris is probably more damaging than narcissism.
But they're sort of closely related.
They are closely related. And I'm thinking, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Probably hubris.
Well, hubris is the one, because there is the story of Narcissus in Greek literature, and there's lots of stories where hubris is the main character flaw. All the Greek mythology with the deities, and all the deities have character flaws. And hubris is sort of the character flaw. The highest level deity has some kind of arrogance, that they think that they have more power than they're entitled to exercise. And so they abuse that power. And so if you have power, the temptation to abuse power is an example of hubris, arrogance. That I have the divine right of kings to,
Yeah, I have to think more about that, but there's a part of, and I will think more about it, but there's a part of me that sometimes thinks that narcissism is a response.
Could be. And by the way, you know that Narcissus in the story has a companion named Echo. You know enough of the story. So there's two characters in the Narcissus story. He sees his reflection in the pool and he falls in love with himself. And Echo is the companion that reinforces it. It's like the mirror. Echo is like the verbal mirror as opposed to the visual mirror. So Echo says, yes, you are exactly how you characterize yourself. So narcissism is made worse by having not only your own self-image, but by being told, reflected back, that I agree with you. What you're imagining about yourself is right, spot on. And so that amplifies the narcissism. It solidifies the narcissism. So it's no accident that the character who echoes narcissism is called Echo, and Echo is hearing your own voice come back to you, essentially. So it's and look at how those words enter our modern vocabulary. Echo becomes the echo of a sound, and narcissism becomes a diagnosis in DSM 345. So the stories that they were writing, these Greek stories, even though they're totally fictional stories or mythology, they were characterizing human traits, which were problematic in some observable way in the fullness of time. It's basically, if you adopt this practice, you're going to come to a bad ending, a tragedy. Shakespeare wrote comedies and tragedies. In comedies, the characters had misconceptions and they acted on those misconceptions and they did stupid things and they died. Or they had a aha moment and they laughed at their stupidity and they corrected their misconceptions. Everybody, lived happily ever after. So he wrote basically the two extreme cases where you found and fixed your misconceptions and when you didn't. If you did, it's a comedy. If you didn't, it's a tragedy. And of course, nowadays we have much more complicated outcomes than simply those two polar opposites. But Shakespeare was very prescient in sort of recognizing how he could invent characters which are very human-like. You can imagine a Hamlet or a Falstaff or somebody like that, and see how when their story played out, it either came to a happy ending or it came to tragedy. Which sort of goes along with Jung saying these archetypes are very powerful psychological tools for learning about our own behavior that we're blind to, and then realizing that we have practices which we ought to correct.
It would be interesting if we could focus more on the patterns, if we would be able to move away from the story and focus more on the patterns. Like you bring up Shakespeare and I think of, all the world's a stage, right. And, we're players. And then I think that there are at least, I know I had seen a YouTube video, one of the physicists were missing, but it seems that the consensus among the experts is that there really is no free will.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that argument over free will is quite interesting because it's not obvious how to resolve it analytically.
Well, to me, it makes perfect sense because I think of it as, you have a script. You can play that script many different ways. So it's sort of like freedom within borders. So again, all of this to me fits together. Yeah. These are patterns we should be looking at. But it's this I just want to add, because this to me is the human condition, this false sense that we can change something. That's where the hubris comes in. So when you were talking earlier about rules, I was thinking very simple rules we could have. Adapt without trying to control as much as possible. And, I tend to think about simple things. So I have a framework of ABCs going back to basics. So I thought adapt, and the B would be becoming. So in the process of becoming, adapt as much as possible without trying to control the outer environment. So it all fits.
There's a very funny anecdote about free will. I probably told this before. And a journalist is interviewing the Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer. And in the course of the interview, he said, the journalist says to Isaac Bashevis Singer, "Do you believe in free will?" And Singer says, "Of course I believe in free will. It's not as if I have a choice in the matter." So he makes a joke out of it, which doesn't really answer he answers the question and then he says it in such a way that falsifies his answer. And that sort of reveals why this whole free will thing is so dicey to and by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned recently, but one of my favorite writers, and he died a few years ago, I actually got to meet him, Raymond Smullyan. He was taught philosophy and logic. at Indiana University and City University of New York. And he wrote a fabulous Socratic dialogue with just two characters. The characters are mortal and God, and they're having a conversation about free will. And the whole point of the conversation is to explore this question of whether or not we have free will. And so he does it in the context of this imaginary conversation between mortal and God. And it begins with the mortal in prayerful supplication to the deity saying, "Dear God, if you have an ounce of mercy for this, your poor mortal soul, please relieve me of the burden of having free will." And that launches them into this conversation. And it's really a fabulous conversation. And by the way, the text of it is up on my website so that I could link to it. I know where to find it. But it's one of several of Socratic, it's a Socratic dialogue. God is playing the role of Socrates. He's asking questions and getting the mortal to sort of think it through and sort of to discover how it comes to pass that he has free will and how God doesn't have any choice in the matter. And a little bit like Socrates, it's about having virtue, because there's a famous Socratic dialogue about virtue. And that's sort of one of the very first Socratic dialogues you study if you bother to study them. So this whole thing about free will, do I have the option of being virtuous and not being black-hearted? And I don't want to cause pain and suffering. And so do I have the freedom of choosing the least harmful course of action and eschew harmful courses of action which are going to hurt me or other people? But it's really all about working the way through that and understanding what's the function of free will. If you believe you have it, what are you supposed to do with it? What do you use it for?
To thine own self be true. I have the most information about myself, so it makes the most sense that when I'm making a decision, I should focus on where I have the most information.
And the question, and so everyone has blind spots, and the thing is,
Right.
Is the blind spot, the gap in your self-knowledge, going to be the place where you stumble and fall? And if you live long enough, you will stumble and fall because of an unrecognized blind spot, and then you'll discover the blind spot and fix it.
Hopefully.
So learning from mistakes is basically learning from a blind spot, something that you didn't have awareness of, which exists, and you needed to have awareness of it. If you had awareness of it, you'd have done something differently.
And so it's such a bad idea when we shame people for making mistakes.
Right.
That is the word that's so counterproductive.
What can you learn from that? So you made a mistake. What didn't you know that if you had known it, you'd have done something different that would have avoided the mistake? And so if you can have a dialogue about what could I have done differently that would have been saner, less foolish, more constructive. And so this metacognition is all about analyzing stumblings and figuring out how to avoid repeating that mistake in the future. And if you don't do that, you'll tend to repeat the same mistake enough times until you finally, it's tattooed on your forehead. I always make this mistake.
And if Doug were here, I think he'd agree. There's just a little bit of judgment in that I want to remove, because sometimes it's not that it was foolish. Sometimes it's that you had or you didn't have information, or that you had erroneous information. So it wasn't that you were foolish. Yeah. It was that you didn't know what you didn't know at the time. So I just want to remove the blame from that.
So a lot of people whose thinking I admire are people who say shaming and blaming is a cultural practice, which is a really, really bad idea. And we should never have introduced the practice of shaming and blaming into the culture. And it causes a lot of problems. And in fact, there are a couple of scholars who studied people who had become convicted of violent criminal offense. And they interviewed these individuals, and they were looking for a common precursor to downstream violence. And shaming and blaming emerged as the most common forerunner and predictor of downstream violent behavior. Yeah. And so now you look at the Proud Boys and Zelda and go, okay, let's apply that observation to them. What kind of shaming and blaming, for example, could they have been exposed to in their formative years that led to their downstream adoption of violent responses. I mean, if you insult somebody, they're liable to, slap you in the face, right? And that's a typical example of a violent reaction to being embarrassed. And I had somebody slap me in the face once, and I had a pile. What caused that? Completely. What did I say or do that caused that? And I had to figure out. Somehow I insulted her. I must have said something that belittled her. But it took me a long time to figure out that was the likely diagnosis, and then what was the gesture that she.
What did I say?
And so I mean that wasn't. Oh, I know what I did wrong. I just like, where did that come from? And basically I had to go look at a bunch of examples in the literature and basically put two and two together because it wasn't obvious. And so there's lots of things like that where you learn from experience, but the answer is subtle and not obvious. And once you get the answer, it doesn't mean that you can easily change your habitual practices. Because that's the other hard part is weeding out the practices which are likely to cause a bad reaction and replacing them with better practices. And I've struggled with, everybody's struggled with that.
Well, that's why the point when I wanted to play that game, the two directives in the game were only do what you want to do, but be honest with yourself about why you don't want to do them or why you do want to do them. Because that was an effort to get to understand our own behavior and to really be clear about that. Because that's what I think we all need to most be doing.
Yeah, I want to win. I want to get the last laugh. I want to come out on top. So this notion, I want to come out on top, in some regard, can be the reason you do something competitive.
But it has to go deeper, Barry. But it has to go even deeper than that, because then it's, why do you want to come out on top? There's a reason, like why? Some people don't care.
Because I bought into the competitive culture, because I correctly or incorrectly understood that we're in a competition. And so we're in a competition that I have to win, you have to lose. And it took me a long time to outgrow the competitive model to the cooperative model. No, we can both gain. We can both gain equally, and nobody wins, nobody loses, but we both gain. Whereas, so the one is the game where it's like this. The other one is the cooperative game where it's like this. Now, I would rather have this than this, but that's not easy to see. It takes a long time to realize that the win-win is smarter than the win-lose where you come out on top.
Maybe in our society it takes a lot longer, but in other societies it doesn't.
America is a very competitive culture. We may be the most competitive because we're capitalistic and free enterprise and competition. And so we have this whole framework of competition, sports and games and everything. And it's all about a scoring system, and there's a winner and a loser.
We're number one in mass shootings.
So, I can't remember exactly when, maybe in my 30s. Well, partly it was because of the prisoner's dilemma. I got fascinated by this piece of game theory called the prisoner's dilemma, where it revealed, it was a very beautiful example of a game where if you play it competitively, everybody loses. And if you play it cooperatively, everybody wins. And it seemed like a paradox, because the framework is that this is a competitive game. And the insight is, if you think that, you're a fool. Even though you're told it's a competitive game, play it as if it's a cooperative game. And then you won't win, you won't lose, you'll tie, but everybody's going to come out ahead. And I may have told the anecdote where shortly after I read all that literature, I was assigned to attend a workshop when I was at Bell Labs. A bunch of us were sent to this workshop on communication within the organization, not telecommunication, but human communication. And there were people there, two of us, I think, from Bell Labs, several people from Western Electric, several people from the operating companies and AT&T, where they were basically the whole Bell system. And one of the people there was a person from the operating company. So she wasn't an operator, but she was in the office of it. And the icebreaker activity was the facilitator divided us up arbitrarily into two groups and said, we're going to play a game. And gave us the scoring rules for the game and the gameplay dynamics. And then on every move of the game, we had to choose one of two choices of things to do. And then the scoring system says who gets how many points everybody gets. So I looked at the scoring system and I go, this looks like the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, it might have taken me a while to recognize it, but eventually I recognized this scoring system looks like it's the prisoner's dilemma, which I've just been reading about in the literature, and it's obscure because it's only in the obscure literature, which somebody like me might have read. So when we caucused to decide our move, I disclosed to my teammates, I said, I think I know this game. I think this is a game that I've been reading about. And in the literature, there's an optimal strategy. But I don't want to spoil the game and give it away. Maybe I should recuse myself. Or I can share with you the optimal strategy. We can test it to see if it works. But I'll let you guys decide. They said, no, tell us and let's play the theoretical optimal strategy and see if it works. So we agreed to do that. So our move followed the recommendation from the literature. And after 3 rounds of the game, the facilitator says, you can have another caucus, separate caucus. We did. We decided to keep on going. And then at the end of, I think it was 6 rounds, they said, you can select a leader from each caucus and you can communicate with the leader of the other group. So I met with the other group and I said, we're playing this game using strategy, which we believe to be optimal. But so it's not to spoil the game. I won't tell you the strategy directly, but I'll simply point out that the game is symmetric. So that if you can figure out the strategy we're using and imitate it, then we'll both be playing optimally and we'll both win. So they went back and they played another 3 rounds and it was clear that they hadn't figured out a strategy. So we had a third, I guess it was maybe second or third meeting of the 2 leaders, and the guy at the other side says, we cannot figure out the strategy of your play. And I say, well, our strategy is a function of your previous moves. We look at your previous moves and we have an algorithm, a formula which says what we should do as a function of what you did just before. So then they go back and they analyze it and they figure it out. And then we play optimally thereafter. And the total score at the end of the 9 rounds or whatever it was is 275 for us, 275 for them. An enormously high score and exactly equal. And I go, yay, we've demonstrated that this method works. So then they had a post-mortem discussion. And people from my side said what it felt like to play the game, and people from the other side said what it felt like. And there was this one woman on the other team who was irate, absolutely irate. She says, this game wasn't fair. They knew how to play the game and we didn't, and we didn't win, and it's not fair. And she was irate. And the facilitator, well, what was your objective? She says, well, to win. And we didn't win. So then they turned to me as the last speaker, and I sort of revealed what I'm sort of saying here, that the whole idea was to get the highest score possible for either side. And it turned out that the optimal strategy is where it's a tie and everybody wins optimally. And she it didn't mollify her. She was absolutely irate. I said, this is very much like my role at Bell Labs, where I'm given a problem to work on that nobody knows how to solve, and I spend 9 months trying to figure out how to solve it. And after I figure out how to solve it, then I have to share the solution with everybody who's got an interest in the game, in the solution. And this is very much the challenge that I have, finding the best way to present the optimal solution so that both sides will agree that this is the optimal solution. And from time to time, I fail to explain it. And the lady is really angry. She says, "You've just laid a guilt trip on me and I refuse to accept the guilt." and the turns back to me and I go, "I give up." So even if you have the optimal strategy on paper and you execute it and it works, they're still mad at you. You've given them the best outcome they could possibly get. They should be happy as hell, and they're angry. What now? What are you going to do? I mean, and this is sort of the problem. I mean, it's a microcosm of the problem you have in real life. That even if you optimally behave like a saint or a perfect educator or perfectly fair and ethical, and everybody comes out ahead of the game, they're still mad at you. Somebody, not everybody. So,
Oh, well. Oh, well.
yeah, oh, well. And then you basically have to take the piss, as it were, and just, laugh it off and go on. So laughing it off is like telling the story, is like laughing it off. But it shows you how difficult it is to live in a culture where the learning process is challenging to facilitate. And even if you do the optimal thing that you know of to make, increase the educational level, the insight level, you'll still have people who are pissed as hell. Okay, I don't know how to fix that.
Well, and that wouldn't be for you to fix. So if it's for anybody to work on, that's another question.
Clearly, I can't fix that problem.
That's
I
not
can
your role.
identify the problem. I can narrate the problem. I can reveal examples of real life examples of the problem, and then I can say, and this is not for me to fix.
Right. And that's a problem that I see happening too often. People whose roles it should not be get into another area where they don't belong, and they wind up making things worse.
Yeah, yeah.
It's almost like, I want to say, stay in your lane.
And remember, I said, should I recuse myself from playing the game at the very beginning? Because I said, I don't know whether it's best to recuse myself because I studied this problem,
Right.
or
Right.
play the game optimally from what I've learned, and which of those is the better choice? And the answer is neither. They're equal. They're equally problematic. In a sense, it's better because I facilitated the learning.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it was better.
It's better because 9 out of 10 people learned and really appreciated learning. And one person, even though technically they learned, they were unhappy.
But here's the thing. Had you done anything differently, there's no that person would have found something else to be unhappy about. It's not likely that what you did caused her unhappiness. She had unhappiness that was going to get expressed in some way.
You may very well be right. And so she dumped her unhappiness problem in my lap, and it's not a problem to solve. But that's sort of the point of people enacting a problem in front of you as if it's your problem to solve, when in fact, there's no way to act back. There's no way to act back the solution except to laugh. And so if I act back laughing, which I didn't, I shrugged instead. Maybe acting back the shrug is the gesture that she should have.
The shrug is and this is where we disagree. So yeah, I think the shrug is better. It's just, if you want to signal that you're bewildered, that's a good thing. So once you laugh, to me, that moves in a direction.
I said, I give up. And maybe that was the gesture that enlightened her, possibly. I don't know. The thing is, I am not entitled to know whether I was effective.
And that goes back to the idea of the best thing is space. So I always think of as a question or a question mark. That's like a space holder.
So I can be a successful educator and invoke the wrath of the learner, and the wrath of the learner will persist. And then at some point it'll subside, and they'll forget about the fact that they were angry at the outcome of the learning episode. And that happens. People suddenly, all of a sudden, we're best friends, and it never bothered them that they were angry at me back at the
there's a lot of nuance in there, too much for what we're going to talk about.
Anyhow, so life is strange, and you can't get out of the fact that life is going to be strange. And so that's why I say I'm often perplexed, because the residual effect of all of these cases where the outcome is like, how did it come out like that, is to be perplexed, which is not a bad emotion. It's just that, it gives you the material for telling stories. I'll tell you that. They'll all turn into stories.
Is perplexed an emotion?
Well, I asked, what's the guy's name? The guy who had the model of the basic emotions. I'm blocking his name. I once asked him, is perplexity an emotion? Because he's always happy, sad, disgusted.
I think it triggers an emotion. It's more like, I think of it as a state. Like,
I'm sorry, what was the word?
I said, I see perplexed as being in a state. I think it triggers an emotion.
Oh,
Like, I think,
yeah. Okay, so confusion. So I consider perplexity to be an affective state. And the question is whether the affective state is mediated by a neuropeptide or by, the signals in your brain. And there are emotions which are represented by patterns of signals in your brain, and there are some that are represented by neuropeptide molecules. And it's not always easy to say it's a molecular surge, neuropeptide surge, or it's a headache. It's a pattern of it's a neural network firing pattern. And I don't know that you can really distinguish those. For me, going around in circles where, like, you start with the premise and you logically figure out what should follow from it, and then you get a conflict at the end. That is that the reasoning is sound until you get back to the beginning, and then it says, no, it can't be correct because it leads to falsifying your assumption. So then you invert the assumption and go around, and it falsifies that one too. That's paradox.
right, but there might be different emotional responses to that perplexity. For somebody, it might just be like, that's odd. To somebody else, it might be like, oh my God, what's happening?
Basically, it's you think of two possibilities, and the answer is none of the above. If you assume possibility A, 0, you get no, it should be 1. Okay, I start with 1, huh? No, it should be 0. So the 1, 0 flip-flopping, that when you go around, it falsifies its original assumption. Well, then you get the answer is none of the above. And you go, okay, then there must be something that's completely outside of this framework. There must be an excluded middle that I never thought of that resolves it. And generally speaking, in studying paradoxes, that's what happens. You invent the excluded middle, which nobody ever thought of. You invent an alternative that never exists conceptually or visibly, and then you invent this.
Now, I understand what perplexed means. What I'm saying is people have a different emotional response to being in a state of confusion or to not. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, some people will lie awake at night trying to think. Other people will just say, no, throw it away. Just discard. Don't think about that. You're just going to drive yourself crazy. Throw it away. So either keep it and try to ponder it, or you throw it away and don't ponder, or you present it to somebody else and say, can you resolve this paradox for me? So yes, completely different behaviors. Ignore it, throw it away, work on it, or tell somebody else about it and ask them to, if they have it.
But that feeling around perplexity is what I refer to as an emotion.
Yeah. Are you curious to find out if there is a solution? Are you uncurious? And so the curiosity to resolve the paradoxes, curiosity is considered an emotion, I think, but I don't know what neuropeptide goes with curiosity, maybe none. Do you think of curiosity as an emotion?
That's an interesting one.
See, I'd be curious to know if curiosity is an emotion.
You know what? I think that might be. Yeah. I think curiosity is an emotion. So, okay. So if I had to just draw like a graph, perplexity would be like that middle point on a line graph, like where the zero would be. That would be perplexity, but curiosity would move. That would move. That wouldn't be at the middle.
Here's a
point.
little puzzle sitting on the table, and it's you have to arrange. I got to turn it upside down, I think, maybe, or I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, depending on what side you show. There's these templates that have holes in them, and you have to arrange the templates and these little things with the so they all fit. And so you say, "Oh, that's curious," because it's a puzzle toy, and you try to arrange it, and you realize, "Gee, I know that when I took it out of the box, they were all fit, everything fit. But now that I try to put it back together, I can't get them to all fit." And so your curiosity, your intrigue, I think is an emotion, intrigue, curiosity, and perplexity is that I can see that there must be a solution. I'm intrigued that the solution is hard to find. I'm curious to find it, and I'm perplexed that I can't find it. So you have all this mixture of intrigue, fascination, curiosity, perplexity, and puzzles and riddles are like that. And people love, well, I'll say people love riddles. Some people love riddles.
Okay, now I have the words. Now I have the words to describe what I think is the difference between perplexity and curiosity. Perplexity is just neutral. There's no force behind perplexity. Curiosity has a force behind it that moves you.
Want to find out.
Yes, yes.
Perplexity says, I don't understand this. I don't get, I don't know, and I don't care. Right.
Right. And curiosity is,
Be totally apathetic. Okay, you know, it's a stupid puzzle. I could care less and ignore it. And even saying it, that's even having a judge. Once you start saying it's stupid, even that's something. So I'm saying you can be genuinely apathetic, or you can articulate apathy where it's not really true. You really would like to know.
right. Then it's thou dost protest too much.
But so the interplay of these states of mind, whether you want to call, this is why we say affect instead of emotion, because people think of emotions maybe
The way I do.
yeah, associated with neuropeptides or sound well, but affect, which is a more,
Yeah, it's a better word.
and that's why affective computing is not called emotional computing, it's called affective computing. And by the way, if you say affective computing, then you can attribute it to machine AIs and machine learning, because they can have affective states just like brains can have, even though they don't have neuropeptides.
Oh, well, I never even heard of it.
Affective.
Of affective computing. Is that what you just called it? Affective computing?
So did you happen to watch that video that was published yesterday?
No, well, I didn't know the term.
Oh, I begin by saying, I wondered if there was an article on affective computing in Wikipedia, because that's the group I'm affiliated with. And I went, oh yeah, there is an article on affective computing. It's pretty good. It's not too bad. Okay. Oh, by the way, it mentions the founder. Oh, her biography. What the hell is that about? But it begins, is there an article on affective computing? Because that was the group that I was affiliated with the Media Lab.
Got it.
So affective computing is the name that Ross selected because she did not want to call it emotional computing. She chose a more
that's funny,
politically neutral term. And that was very prescient on her part. Now, other people do call it emotional computing. And I say the role of emotions in learning because I'm interested in how humans learn and the role of emotions in human learning. But if you have learning machines or artificial AI, that adaptive learning, then you have affective states that guide the direction that the AI is trying to find the end. So if I give an AI a puzzle, whether it's a Sudoku puzzle or any kind of puzzle, where it can form a model and then try to find the configuration, it's going to have some kind of search. It could be completely random search, which is not very interesting, or it could have a non-random search where it sort of says, I think it's more likely that I'm going to find the answer this way than that way. And so it has some kind of a strategy for zeroing in on the solution with the least amount of time and computation. So people who solve problems, when I see these people using logic to solve Sudoku problems, I see they're not using raw emotion. They're using strategies based on knowledge and intuition, which are not pure emotion. At least they don't look like pure emotion. And so And by the way, there are algorithms that will solve Sudokus. The computer algorithms will solve them too. And they solve them in a systematic manner. They will try a sequence of methods from the most likely to work to the least likely to work in some rank order. And sometimes they will find the solution inefficiently, but they'll find it. And sometimes they'll say, this solution is not appearing by anything other than a totally random search. They can't find a logical path, even though a logical path exists. And then the human will reveal the logical path that the computer solver doesn't have. And then they can turn around and maybe program that method into the AI. And in fact, a lot of the ones I look at that are interesting are the ones where there is no obvious logic. There is a logical path, but it's by no means the ones you would normally think of. All the ones you would think of are not the ones that work. But there is. And by the way, the ones that work are typically pattern-based. They're based on patterns, and we do not have a public language for patterns yet. That's a frontier. Is there a language for characterizing patterns? The answer is you can name known patterns. You can make a catalog of patterns where here's a representation, here's the name of it. That's catalog. But for an arbitrary pattern you've never seen before, how would you characterize it in a language? The answer is we don't have one. We do not have a pattern language. That is a holy grail of pattern thinking.
And, even though I have no math background, no computer background, I'm so drawn to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I get into these conversations with you.
People are pretty good at pattern thinking. And that's why we say that these people are geniuses, because they can see and work the pattern that nobody else sees, because nobody else has the neural network wired up to say, I recognize that pattern. So if I hold up my hand, everybody will say, oh yeah, that's a human palm with 5 fingers. They'll recognize that pattern. But if I put up some other geometrical shape, they'll go, I have no idea what the hell that thing is. Never seen one of those before. Does it have a name? Does it have a mathematical model? So we recognize patterns which are useful, for survival, and there are geometric patterns which, this pattern, why does that matter to me? Okay, do I have a life and death issue over how I arrange these balls in these little holes? Well, generally no, but that's why it's an interesting puzzle, because it has a pattern which you have to do some kind of pattern thinking to figure it out, and it's not any that you would ever have learned in school or encountered before, and yet you're intrigued and curious. Is there a way that I can use my pattern thinking to find the pattern that allows me to fit everything together and nothing clashes? If you put it wrong, 2 balls will be in the same spot and they won't go together. They each have to go in their own private hole.
Well, actually, you learn a lot about patterns from that thing in school with tic-tac-toe.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a tic-tac-toe board.
Yeah, except that you add a symbol to a vacant square always. Where in this one, you go, how do I know which vacant square to add the ball to, such that I'm going to end up with no place to put the last ball, which I have to place. Because in this one, I have to place all of the balls somewhere. So it's not quite this. It's similar to tic-tac-toe in the sense that it's a 3x3
But it's a different lesson, because in tic-tac-toe, what you learn is if you starting in the middle is the strength.
Yes.
I think that's an important lesson.
If you start
that gets overlooked.
in the middle, and whatever the other guy does, there is an optimal move for you, which is a function of where they place theirs.
Right.
So that's again like that prisoner's dilemma, that whatever the other guy does, you use that to find out the optimal place for you next. And then it's a tie. Tic-tac-toe is always a tie if you do the optimal thing, because they have a freedom of choice. Doesn't matter where they put it. Wherever they put it, your choice is now forced to get to the tie.
But imagine if we took that learning from that pattern recognition and we applied it to politics.
Yeah, exactly. You'd say, I don't want to win, because winning means that I will gain a little over what you lose, but I could gain a lot more if we cooperate. We can both gain a lot more. And the notion that we can both gain a lot more by cooperation That seems like common sense. And yet here we are in global politics, and it's not happening at world class and national class politics. You go, are we really that dumb as a species?
Well, and this goes to the conversation we were having yesterday. And I suggested that instead of focusing on finding agreement to the next step, we focus on finding agreement to the direction we're going in.
Do we agree to cooperate for the benefit of all?
Towards a common intention.
Can we find common ground and common gain and common benefit that benefits everybody and hurts no one? And the answer is, if you agree to adopt that, then yes, you can usually find something that everybody is better off. And if you don't agree to that, there's going to be at least one person in the group who cannot agree to reach an agreement where everybody's better off. And why that is perplexing. It's intriguing, it's fascinating, it's perplexing, it's confounding, it's aggravating, and it makes you shrug. And if you shrug enough, you stop playing the game, because you keep running into these people who throw the monkey wrench into the process, and you say, we cannot have this person in the collaboration community because they don't get the concept of collaboration. Whatever you do, they're not going to agree.
Or we could find a new way.
Well, so for example, we talked about on Zoom, if you have this one person who's the troll, the disruptor, won't shut up, okay, you can create a breakout room and everybody goes to the breakout room except you leave that one in the lobby. So you leave the disruptor in the lobby, and everybody else retreats to the mezzanine. And the mezzanine is only, so you end up having a schism between the intelligentsia and the non-intelligentsia. You leave the non-intelligentsia behind, which at the same time makes you kind of feel bad for them, because are you doing them any good? You're abandoning them. And I don't know the solution to that. I know that you can have a small group that does good stuff, but then you're the aristocrats. You're creating the aristocracy, and you're leaving the hoi polloi behind. Is that smart?
No. And this is a much bigger conversation with lots of nuances.
End up creating the entertainment, where the entertainment is for the hoi polloi to illuminate them. And I don't see anything wrong with it. Can the aristocrats become the entertainers who create good entertainment that is also educational for the hoi polloi?
The best I could say is when I was a classroom teacher and I put on a school production, a play, I looked at before I chose the play I was going to do, I looked at my students and I looked at their personalities, their strengths, and I created the play around them, around who, and the plays were always great. And, little kids don't always put on the best plays. These were, people really liked them because I was choosing characters that fit the qualities of the kids. But the other thing is, the ones that weren't the good performers, I gave them important roles that weren't necessarily the speaking roles. Maybe they were making scenery. Right. Maybe they were, doing other things. So again, I think it's important to find a place for everyone.
So maybe your place is in the audience to critique the presentation. And so you can't have a play without an audience. So you put the hoi polloi in the audience and say, your job is to be an audience. And then after that, say what you got out of the play.
But I also think there's a time and place for everyone to be in the audience. Like I get a little bit, because of, my own position, a little sensitive to separating, the academics from the regular population, because.
Think about families having pets and children, and the parents are the audience to the antics and shenanigans of the pets and the children. And they are amused by the shenanigans of the kids, even though the shenanigans would be inappropriate if you were an adult or an adult human. So yeah, the parents can be the audience to the kids and the kids can be the audience to the parents. And when they're each playing their respective roles, when the kids are playing, they're playing.
But there's also something to be, and not but, there's also something to be said for honest feedback. So, there are a lot of times that people say or do things and they tell themselves they're trying to be nice. Is it really nice if you're encouraging a behavior in someone to continue by acting as if it's okay? See, I've never thought that's a nice thing to do. I've had heated discussions with people about this.
You have to ask yourself, if the other person imitates what I'm doing, am I going to be distressed? So you want to enact practices which would be fabulous if they were imitating them.
Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So maybe somebody would tell a joke that's inappropriate. Now, in some situations, I'm going to open up my mouth. I'm going to say, that's inappropriate. It shouldn't be said. But there are other times where somebody might say, who are you to say what's appropriate? And that's a valid point as well. So what I'm saying is, in those situations, like I know at least in the past, I just don't laugh. My face stays.
Oh, that hurts my ears.
But let's say I don't want to, whatever. If it's an inappropriate time and place, at least I can remain stone-faced.
Yeah. So
Like there are different degrees.
You either don't react at all, or you say, oh, that hurts my ears, which is not criticizing the joke. It's simply characterizing, So, I mean, when somebody says it hurts me when something happens, if that's true, if you're really honestly saying that hurts me, then you're giving the other person the freedom of choosing not to hurt you.
Well, you also give them the freedom of asking why, because I've done that as well. Sometimes people don't want to know, and they don't care. And I don't know who's here, but
That's Teese. I'm going to let him in. That's Teese.
Okay, well, we can say hello or you can speak, but I really have to go anyway.
Yeah, it's coming up at 1 o'clock, and so we'll
Hi,
say
Teese. I'm on my way out.
And then hi, Teese. We've been here for 2 hours. We're sort of all talked out, and also
It's just me and Barry.
Also, I have to tell you, Teese, in case you don't know, this weekend here in the United States is the Independence Day, 4th of July weekend. And I live in a condo. We're going to have some kind of event this afternoon, which is already 1 o'clock. So we're not going to stay online.
Okay, no problem. I know I'm late. Just
say hello and ask if there's anything you want to share before we call it a day.
Oh, well, we had the neighborhood day, so events, so certain people had their gardens open with music. So I went somewhere with tiny houses, and I got a tour around the tiny houses venue with 14 tiny houses.
Super. So anyway, so we're about to head off, and Sam is actually with his daughter. He's having a one-on-one with his daughter. So he started the session, but he's not actually attending.
Hey, Barry,
But,
I just want to say, I loved this conversation. I don't know if anybody's going to enjoy watching it, but I loved having it.
You can watch it and maybe write up a synopsis of the gains. What did you learn from today's session, or what did you appreciate from today's session? And that might
Favorite topic.
that might stimulate others to take a look at it to see, oh, I mean, last week's Kayla said that she learned something from something I said, and the thing is, I don't remember what she said. She got out of it, and I would have to go back and try to play the whole 2 hours and try to figure out what was Kayla referring to when she said she got something that was worth getting. And I really would like to know, what did I do right? Because I don't remember what I said or did that was the thing that was the spark for her. And again, if you say this was the spark that lit my fire, that would be nice to know, at least for somebody like me, because I don't want to waste time not lighting sparks. I'd like to know what is the thing that actually worked for Stacy, for Kayla, for anybody, and skip the other junk that's just wasting time. boring people and making their eyes glaze over.
Going. Bye. See you next week.
Yeah, bye, bye.
So here we are, once again, at the end of the hour, end of the 2 hours.
Yeah, but so you're going to leave anyhow, so I'm don't keep you up. So I'm leaving now. So bye.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and end the session. We'll
Yep.
see everybody
Bye.
next